and we are going to talk with some of the thought leaders in health IT, electronic health records, standards, interoperability, etc. Doug is going to give a little presentation, and then we're going to open it up for questions. We're hoping to go 35 to 45 minutes. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Doug.
Now I have to make sure that I'm managing my mute appropriately. So thanks to everybody for attending. It's nice to actually see your faces while we're doing this, because typically we're on teleconferences together, but we don't actually get a chance to see each other's faces. So I apologize if you have to look at my face, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity to just sort of try out this technology and take a look at how this works. I know that Brett talked about, everybody has an opportunity to ask questions. I'm hopeful that this is not just question and answer, but this is a dialogue. I sort of made a commitment this year to try to improve our ability to communicate around really hard things. And so you'll probably be seeing that there's a regular blog that's coming out just about every week, and that we're trying to make sure that we talk about some of the hard questions that are out there with regard to interoperability, Meaningful Use Stage 2, what we're trying to do with Meaningful Use Stage 3, and some of the other activities that we've got within my office. So with that, I wondered if we can just very, very briefly go through the slides. This is really more just to kind of kick off things, remind people about some of the activities that are ongoing. And then from there, I would just as soon kind of open it up and let's talk about what would be interesting to you in terms of our conversation. So why don't we go to the first slide there? So Brett, I guess you can just sort of share that. So is everybody seeing the slides? I just want to make sure. No.
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet.
So I think Brett needs to share those. So I want a thumbs up when you see the slides.
We've
Until then,
selected
you can
it.
just have sort of 5 looks.
We've selected it, Doug. I don't know what the problem is.
You want me to just share mine?
Yeah, if you can do that. Thanks.
Okay. Let me see. Hang on just a moment.
There we go.
Are people seeing it now? Okay. So let me see if I can manage this. Sorry about the fades. This is something I need to think about. So in my particular office, I like to say there are 4 things that we do, and any of these things are really fair game for the kinds of conversation that I think we can have over the course of the next hour. So the first thing that we do is we enable stakeholders to come up with simple shared solutions. And this really represents the work that we're doing in the Standards and Interoperability Framework, and some of the work that you'll be hearing about in the next couple of weeks about how we are going to help support implementation and testing of that of some of our technology. The second thing that we do, of course, is we curate a portfolio of standards, services, and policies that accelerate information exchange. And I think this goes to the fundamental underlying approach that we've got, which is to say it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. We have a portfolio that includes standards that help us with content, standards that help us with structure, and standards that help us with meaning, with transport, all of the different pieces that we need. And much of what we've got in our portfolio has been described in Meaningful Use Stage 2, and we're working on extending that portfolio to help support some of the activities that we see coming down the pike with Meaningful Use Stage 3. We also support innovation, and so we do have some folks that have just recently joined us that are helping us coordinate with the CTO's office at HHS and to try to create an innovation portfolio. In large part, this is because I think we need to make sure that the standards that we create and the policies that we adopt will actually drive innovation in the marketplace, or at least not inhibit innovation within the marketplace. And providing that connection into that innovation community, I think, is going to be an important piece of what we do. And finally, we collaborate. We collaborate across a lot of the federal agencies that participate in healthcare exchange the Federal Health Architecture, which the HIT Policy Committee got a briefing on just in the last 2 weeks, is our way of taking the standards and developing an interoperability architecture that helps support the federal agencies and their ability to exchange information as well. So those are really the only 4 things that we do. We work on enabling stakeholders to come up with solutions. We curate a portfolio of things that work. We support innovation to make sure that we're driving marketplace changes and really transformational things that we'd like to see in the marketplace. And then finally, what we do is we collaborate with our federal partners through the federal health architecture and the work that we've got within that. A couple of things. None of these slides should be new, but just to remember that our role here is not to actually build large systems, but actually to use government as a platform for innovation to create the conditions of interoperability. And that means focusing on the interstitial spaces between the things and the entities that are going to be exchanging information. We recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we can talk about this notion of an ultra-large-scale system and the characteristics of that suggests that we're going to have heterogeneity in our healthcare system, and that's going to be reflected in the health IT that is used within the healthcare system. And so that's why this notion of a portfolio, to having a variety of tools in our toolbox, becomes so important. And finally, we're not going to be able to do this in a big bang. We're going to have to do it incrementally. We're going to have to learn from each step along the way, and we're going to have to use it to modify our approach and to add things to our portfolio to make sure that we get there. So our job is to enable others to succeed, to focus on the interstitial spaces and the way in which that exchange will occur, to make sure that we've got an approach that allows for heterogeneity and not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that we need to build things incrementally. And that's sometimes challenging because different organizations are in different stages in their maturity for being able to exchange electronic information. So these are the sorts of questions that I ask myself. When we're thinking about moving forward with a particular initiative, or we're trying to think about what are the kinds of standards that are out there. Although it's not perfect, does it represent the best we have so far? So we want to take best of breed, but we're not going to let perfect be the enemy of good. And that means that we need to incrementally build, and we need to have processes that allow us to take what's out there and to enhance it as we go forward. Is it the next step in an incremental approach to refining the standards and implementation guides? We want to make sure that we don't get ourselves down a sidetrack that is a dead end. But in fact, we want to make sure that we're incrementally moving towards that goal state that we have about having information be exchanged securely between different entities. Does it support our policy objectives? Do we have the notions of transparency and protecting privacy and security for patients? Does it support having patients get access to their own information? And those are the sorts of things that become important. And I think because interoperability is not considered sort of a one-size-fits-all, we need to be able to create modularity and the ability to kind of pull those building blocks together to support the kinds of information exchange that we have going on. We're on a journey together. I think this is something that we can start to tee up things, but somebody once said that I don't know who said it, but it's probably true, is that the smartest people don't work in government. And I can say that because I work in government. And that, in fact, we need to leverage the community because there's a lot of really smart people out there that we can then help kind of coordinate and support and help them for us to get to the kinds of information exchanges and the sorts of things that we'd like to see in Meaningful Use Stage 2, 3, and beyond. So, excuse me, just to sort of give you a sense of the portfolio and kind of this feeds into our strategy that we've got. We've got kind of 5 things that we work on. The blog that I did just this past week talks about some additional things that we might think about in terms of an interoperability portfolio that include work process and dynamic as well as static ways of exchanging information and fitting into the workflow. But this is sort of the initial set of building blocks that we've got. So we work on standardizing meaning through vocabularies and code sets. We try to standardize structure through some of the specifications that we have for HL7 version 2 and HL7 version 3. We work on standardizing transport using SMTP and the direct protocols, as well as allowing for SOAP-based approaches for information exchange as well. Security is an important piece of the portfolio, and we leverage much of the work that's going on with NIST. We don't come up with new security specifications that are unique to healthcare, but we try to leverage best of breed that are out there in the community. And then we've got sort of a catch-all that we call services. And services is one of those things that, to me, are the verbs, not the nouns. If nouns are the things you exchange, then verbs are the things you can do. And so services are ways of, examples would be published APIs or web services that might be available, ways that we can sort of coordinate and orchestrate the different kinds of information exchange that we might see, and making sure that electronic health records have certain kinds of functions that allow them to have functionality to reach out, to understand what common data elements are, or to be able to be queried and get responses back that match the standards that we've got adopted from a federal perspective. So with that, I'm going to just sort of stop, and I am going to stop sharing my screen. I guess at this point, I'll turn it back over to Brett and see how he'd like to manage things. I think people, if they have questions, they certainly could raise their hand. We'll take a look at that, and then we can let Brett keep an eye on what's going on. Now, John, because we've got a static version of things, you'll have to, we'll probably have to call on you directly, or you may want to just use the chat feature if you've got a particular comment or want to get into the conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brett, and we'll start the conversation.
Thanks, Doug. I'm just going to go start from the bottom left and go left to right with questions, if that's okay with everyone. So Alice, you are up. If you have anything you want to ask Doug, if not, you can pass.
I think if Alice doesn't have a question, then I get the opportunity to ask her a question.
Okay.
No, I wasn't trying to raise my hand. I just wasn't able to hear you, Brett. I was trying to figure out how to get sound back.
Okay. Do you have anything you want to ask Doug? Are you guys not able to hear me?
We can hear you.
Yep.
I don't know if Alice can, though.
No, I can now.
Okay. Do you have a question for Doug?
So Alice, you get to start out the conversation.
Okay.
So,
I don't think you want to put me in the driver's seat here, especially.
Okay. Well, do you want us to come back to you? You want us to come back to you then?
That would be great.
Okay.
Arian, do you have anything?
Arian, who is never at a loss for words,
I
probably
would
can
never
start
have
this
a question. Why would I ever have a question? So I've actually something I've been thinking about, and I would love for your to hear how you're framing this and thinking about this. And it's really about the timeline. And I know there's a lot of stuff you can't talk about, but about the timeline for stage 3. And how much of the interoperability work do we push through meaningful use versus look for other kinds of levers like accountable care and the whole CMMI portfolio? And the reason I'm asking this is we're seeing a lot of, I think, very helpful talk about population health management, around care management, that are being driven more from an accountable care perspective than from a meaningful use perspective. We're trying to potentially do some innovative things to support all of that work. And we're starting to see a challenge where organizations are saying, whoa, my hands are full with this meaningful use stuff. So how do you frame the need to keep pushing forward using the one lever you got versus pulling back and allowing more flexibility for some of the other levers that you have or that are going on concurrently in the ecosystem?
So there are some policy decisions that need to be made with regard to timing, and so I don't really have an answer to kind of what that would look like. But let me tell you what I've been thinking about. I don't think that we've sort of operationalized it, and If you tell me that this is a really bad approach, then we may want to rethink things. But let me just sort of frame kind of what I am thinking about. I think the first thing is that what we've got right now is sort of episodic disruptions of the marketplace every time a regulation comes out. It's difficult to plan for. It's difficult to include in the kinds of software development cycles that the vendors are working on. And so one of the things that I'm wondering, and I'd welcome people's comments about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, is we shouldn't think about this as the only time that we have an opportunity to make a difference is when we write a regulation. And in fact, I'd like the goal that we have to get to better and better interoperability to be an ongoing conversation. So what if we had, for example, a regular schedule that said, listen, every 6 months, maybe every 3 months, whatever the industry thinks is a reasonable time frame, every 6 months, we do an update to our portfolio. Maybe there's an implementation guide specification that needs to be updated, or we have a change that needs to be incorporated. Maybe there's a new S&I framework initiative that now has come up with some new specifications that need to be validated, and that we could then look ahead 6, 12, 18 months to get a sense for what are the things that we think will be ready in 6 months or in 12 months, and we just put that on the list. We issue a change log about what's changed in our portfolio so that vendors can begin to anticipate what things might be happening and where they need to be able to insert themselves in that development process. There may be some changes that don't affect a particular vendor, others that would have significant effects, but having that kind of transparency about kind of what we're working on and what goes into the portfolio, I think is one of the things that we're thinking about. Second thing that we're thinking about is that what happens is that each of the regulation releases become sort of 2.0 or 3.0 or 4.0 in terms of kind of the suite of standards that we might have. And we know that in between those releases, there's going to be dot releases, there's going to be bug fixes, there's going to be security patches, there's going to be other things that we need to do. So that when a product becomes certified, there is possibility that 6 months or 12 months later we find something that needs to be changed or updated, and there's the ability for us to update our standards and specifications based on community input, and then figure out a way to then apply a patch that gets us better towards interoperability. So these are ideas that we're thinking about. I don't think that we've made any decisions, but the whole notion of creating better transparency about what we're doing. Our regulations become just a roll-up of the conversations that have gone on the 6 or 12 or 18 months before that. And then what we do is we create a way of doing a change log, anticipating what kinds of things we might work on, and make that kind of a conversation that happens in public so that people can anticipate what might be changing, can make sure that they've got the appropriate resources that they need when they need to engage. And I think what that does is it creates it creates a pathway that we all can work together towards getting to interoperability that isn't so highly reliant on meaningful use regulations, but can leverage some of the other things that are going on with ACOs and with accountable care.
Okay, Brian is up next.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for putting this on. This is fun. So I'd just like, first off, to kind of spin off of what Arian just said, in that, and I think that you look at the healthcare industry right now, it's changing remarkably and quickly. And as the meaningful use incentive payments begin to decline in the amount and scale up in the requirements, I'm seeing a lot more interest in folks having the IT infrastructure to support accountable care solutions and be able to support these new payment and care delivery models, which I believe is the entire point of meaningful use. And I'd like to see potentially maybe even some alignment with certification and the CMS requirements for accountable care strategies rather than tying it only to meaningful use. I think that the certification program, the standards that are required for interoperability, that's something that can live far beyond a temporary incentive program, but really kind of be embedded into the ecosystem for healthcare. But what I wanted to ask you was about the federal health architecture, just to kind of set some context, because I think it's confusing. It's confusing for me. It's probably confusing for a lot of people exactly how all of this came about. You've got the federal health architecture, you've got the ONC, you've got CMS, you've got a lot of different moving parts. People that aren't as familiar with the federal government may not understand. I was very excited when I saw the REX, the Restful Health Exchange Initiative, kind of embedded in the Standards and Interoperability Framework initiatives. And so, I think it'd be good maybe if you could just really briefly outline how the federal health architecture fits within all the other interoperability and standards work that you're doing at the ONC.
Sure. So I couldn't agree more. I think one of the challenges, well, first of all, to your initial comment, one of the things that's important to recognize with high tech is that Congress gave us responsibility for establishing the standards, implementation guides, and certification criteria for health information technology. It wasn't tied to the incentive program. It was a broader charge that we had as well. And so I think, to your point, it lays a foundation that can help us with accountable care and the other things that are out there. I think the kinds of conversations that we need to hear from the public is, kind of to your point, what do we need in our portfolio that we don't have now that may need to be there to support accountable care organizations? And so, do we need different kinds of standards or different kinds of services that will allow shared care plans, for example, to occur, or distributed ways of editing or charting or whatever that helps support these more distributed and organizations. So I think that's a conversation that we need to have, and we have to make sure that we choose the right tool out of our portfolio to solve the right problem. And if we choose a good tool but we apply it to the wrong problem, we could get ourselves into trouble, and I think we have to be careful about that. With regard to the federal health architecture, I think the FHA, the actual federal health architecture activities, I don't know if it started at exactly the same time, if it was just before or just after ONC was established that they put together the FHA. It certainly occurred before my tenure here at ONC. But I think the thing that the federal health architecture has done is it's provided a place where the federal partners, those that deal with health information exchange, and it's primarily the agencies represented within HHS, CDC, and CMS, for example, the DoD and the VA have all been sort of charged from the Office of Management and Budget to contribute resources into developing a shared understanding of the federal health architecture. I think initially when it was conceived, we thought about this as an enterprise architect activity. I think what we've done more recently is to focus on really an interoperability architecture so that we don't necessarily have to change what a particular agency does inside, but to focus on the ways in which they might exchange information between different agencies. And so under Lauren's leadership, we've really started to focus more on the standards and the specification and figuring out how to do that. The federal health architecture as well was engaged early on with some of the nationwide health information network specifications. The initial suite of standards that ONC developed, those standards were operationalized through the Connect tool that was funded and supported by many of the agencies within the federal health architecture. And so that was an accelerant to try to test and develop working code that would be reflective of those standards. We have spent, in fact, the Connect 4.0 was just released in the last day or so, with a focus on streamlining that, making it a little bit lighter weight, having a lot more capacity within it as well, in some sense refactoring that. And that's something available out in the open source. What I found is that it has been invaluable to have a place where the federal partners can come in and bring their requirements, and that we can sort of fold that into the work that we're doing within ONC. I also think that going forward, it's going to be increasingly important that our federal partners that do a tremendous amount of health information exchange, not only within the agencies, but across and into the private sector, are going to be an important effector arm of what we need to do to get to interoperability. And so having CMS and FDA and SSA and the VA and DoD together to focus on those things, I think is going to be an important aspect of keeping us connected to the important agencies that are struggling as well with trying to exchange information out there in the private sector. Does that help?
Anyone? Okay, Devin, you have a question?
Yeah, I sure do. I want to add on to the conversation about sort of where does meaningful use 3 go given dwindling incentives and the need to make sure that organizations are geared up for participation in accountable care organizations and various payment reform models. This very conversation took place at the Health IT Policy Committee just last week. And the Meaningful Use Work Group and the Certification and Adoption Work Group are beginning to meet to sort of think about what direction should we be headed in for stage 3, whether that would be sort of through an maybe an alternative pathway for MU stage 3, or whether in fact you could get credit for participation in an ACO that would be part of what you would demonstrate for meaningful use. So the conversation that just took place on this Hangout is taking place in other sort of aspects of the ecosystem as well, and I think it's an incredibly helpful conversation to have. I'm going to steer the discussion in a slightly different direction, and that's about the issue of patient-generated data and the ability for that data to be incorporated into electronic medical records when the provider thinks it's valuable for care delivery purposes. And one of the sort of pushbacks that we're getting on the policy end of that conversation is the lack of standards for that type of data, whether it's the type of data that comes from a medical device or maybe is even more less standardized data, like how well did you sleep last night, and let's keep track of that over time and see how well a certain medication is doing with respect to that aspect of your life, which is important for your health and well-being. Does every piece of data need a standard in order for it to be appropriate to be part of a clinical care record?
So that's a simple thing to answer, no.
Good. I like that answer.
So to me, there's a couple of things. I mean, I think when it comes to devices, consumer devices, we have to coordinate with the FDA that's working to develop unique device identifiers so that we have the provenance as to where that information came. Right. They're approaching that, and there's an RFI that's out there right now. I'm sorry, NPRM, I think, and they're just getting the comments back. But their proposal there was to try to tackle this in reverse order, pick those things that are under the most regulatory scrutiny, so implantable devices that sort of are about, anesthesia units and, implantable pacemakers and things like that, and then work their way back to sort of class 2 and class 1 devices. Class 1 devices would be things like elastic bandages. Class 2 are going to be things that are more along the lines of what we would consider consumer devices like glucometers and blood pressure cuffs and things like that. And I think we need to try to help make sure that we align with their approach, because we're going to need this unique device identifier, I think, to make sure that we have the provenance for where that data came from. I think we should leverage wherever possible those standards that currently exist, and a simple change would be to take our consolidated CDA and add a patient as a author of record. And that would be a simple thing for us to do. It wouldn't require a lot of work. The way that the CDA works is that it has not only structured data, but it also allows for unstructured data as well. Yeah. And so it may be possible to create a patient-specific template that would allow unstructured data to be able to be put in. I will tell you this, that when it comes to medication reconciliation and understanding what a patient is taking, I trust the patient far more than I do any consultant who might send me what their list is of the medications that patient has been prescribed. Right. And so I think there are certain kinds of patient-generated information that physicians in general will see as being more valuable and probably being more accurate than provider generated or device generated or things like that. So it's an important aspect of that, and I think I certainly subscribe to the notion that the patient is not someone who interacts with the system, but is in fact a part of the system. And as a result, we have to figure out ways that we can engage them effectively so that the important information that they have, like what pills are you taking, which oftentimes are different than what pills you are prescribed, can be represented and incorporated in that medical record.
Yeah, and that's really helpful to know, Doug. And I think it's more that the types of sort of, maybe it's not exactly out of the box thinking, but what are some innovative things that we can do in the short term to facilitate that kind of patient generated data? Somehow that the conversation we've just had doesn't seem to be trickling up through committee structures that are thinking about these things now. So this is helpful.
What I'd like to see is I'd like us to get to the point where we can, take our existing standards. Is there a quick fix that we could do that would enable the patient to be, an author of record? And once you have that, then we can leverage a lot of our existing standards that are out there. We may have to think through, what that would look like with regard to the work process and things.
Yep.
And then we can refine it from there. But, absolutely, we cannot, patients should not have to enter SNOMED codes to be able to put in their problem list. They need to be able to, in their own words, describe what's going on and feel empowered to include that as part of the medical record or as part of the conversation that they might have with their doctor.
Yeah.
A doctor, she might just take that information and translate it. That's okay. Mm-hmm. But the thing that's important is that the patient feels as if they're a part of the system and can contribute.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, next up, John. You have a question?
Sure. I've actually got a kind of an update as well that might be useful. I know the question's been asked about a RESTful way to access health information, and I've been working with both IHE and HL7 through some of the ABBY projects as well to create RESTful interfaces. One of them is from IHE, the mobile health documents, but that's also been pulled into HL7 as part of FHIR. And then we're also taking the REX work that S&I worked on and giving it a home within IHE. So we're also working on that kind of security layer. So I think that's a really positive move to offer up different ways of accessing this information. I guess I'd like to, then ask the question: in what ways can we see that folded in over time? Clearly, it's very infantile at this point, but I think it'd be great to see some recognition of some of those things, or some ways in which we can excite some different health information exchanges or different health providers to offer that.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I'm glad you sort of brought up some of the work that's going on within IHE. I think there's been tremendous energy and a lot of really good work that's come out of the mobile work group there, really creating some simple approaches. It marries very nicely with the FHIR work that is going on within HL7. A lot of those pieces are still in flux. I mean, FHIR is something that is just brand new, but they're saying a lot of the right things, and I think demonstrations and actual use of those standards in real-world settings are going to be important. We talked about this before. It was one of the recommendations that we got from the HIT Standards Committee when they did some of their initial assessments around transport standards, and they said, direct is a path of least regret. We need to simplify some of the things going on with web services, but gee, we really wish we could work through some of the RESTful approaches and figure out ways that we could align with that as well. And I think the work in the mobile group within IHE has been helpful, and I've been sort of tracking, and the fact that the REX project has gotten a home and some purchase there, I think has been very, very useful. With regard to what we include in Meaningful Use Stage 2 and 3 and subsequent stages, I think that's still an ongoing conversation. A lot will depend on timing and what we can get ready in time. But like I said, I want to try to get to a point where we really can kind of go through the, not have this hurry up and try to get things into meaningful use stage 2 or stage 3, but to be thoughtful in developing a portfolio that can serve not only the needs of meaningful use, but accountable care organizations and the shared goals of getting to interoperability. And so there may be ways in which we can think through how to incorporate things into the portfolio that are, I don't want to say nascent, that's not the right word, but some standards that haven't been adopted as federal regulation but are clearly valuable and lots of people are using them. And that's the kind of conversation that we need to continue to have to figure out the best way to do that, and would welcome input from this group and others to try to figure out exactly how to do that.
Yeah, I think this stuff is not at all ready for something like meaningful use stage 3. But there's got to be some way to have a maturity model, if you will, such that there is a recognition that this is, I don't know if you're saying it's the horizon or if you're saying this is an alternative that's acceptable or something, some way to recognize that there is sometimes a need to have some of the industry move to something before all of the healthcare industry has to move. We certainly had some really great feedback from 2 different connectathons or hackathons, if you will. Both HL7 had one and IHE had one at Connectathon. So there's a lot of good feedback, but mostly it turns into, this is great technology, I know how to use it, it's pretty simple, but I don't have anybody asking for it. So that's kind of where I'm sitting.
Yeah, and so yeah, there we go. Brett, I can manage the mic. There's a couple of things. I think if I had to think about, so let me just, there are a bunch of things you say that I want to comment about. The first is this maturation maturity model. Part of the discussions that we had within the NWHI Empower team was to try to get us there. I don't think we're there entirely. We certainly don't have the sophistication of what the Software Engineering Institute has, but that's precisely, I think, what we need in evaluating the portfolio of standards that are out there. I think a second thing to say is that if there's a federal standard that's been adopted as part of a federal program, be it meaningful use or through Health and Human Services or the like, we should use that. That should be our first choice. If there is a use case or a need to have some kind of information exchange and there is no federal standard or national standard that's been adopted, then we should really think about working through standards development organizations to sort of identify those consensus-based standards, voluntary consensus-based standards that have had wide adoption, and use those as sort of our second line of defense. But I think what you're suggesting, and I think it's a good one, is that sometimes there isn't a federal standard, there's not a voluntary consensus standard just yet. And how do we kind of add to our portfolio? And I think we do need to think about those kind of 3 buckets and figure out a way to make sure that folks who can say the federal one doesn't quite work, there's really not something in the SDO, I want to be able to do this. It allows the industry to get out there and drive a lot of the standardization because they have a need for it. And then to work with the standards development organizations and the work that we do with the federal government to try to add that to the portfolio and have a mechanism to include that as a standardized way of exchanging information. We need to have both an on-ramp. So how do we take a use case or a particular technology challenge and drive it towards standardization that can be adopted nationally? And we also need to be able to understand that sometimes there will be better ways to do things, and how do we transition from old ways to new ways. And I think we have to actively manage our portfolio, if you will, to make sure that we provide tools for the transitions as well as a pathway for nascent standards that need to sort of become more mature and get more piloting and testing.
Thanks.
Okay, does that help? Okay, who's next?
John, are you ready?
Yeah, I am. Thank you. Hope Steve Posnick's not listening. I always give him some hard questions. But, Doug, I want to go back to kind of a policy question that I think Arian raised. Two things, and I'll ask first question first, second question second. You almost described a potential for certification to become more modular, and I know that's a loaded term, but I mean not so insistent that there's a baseline of the whole criteria set that necessitates a broad-scale market recertification to that version, but more for the purpose of advancing a policy objective that's fairly specific. You know, let's say for argument's sake, the ESMD standard gets adopted into a certification requirement, so to advance that objective, you know, a vendor may need to go certify on that, but that doesn't obsolete. I guess my question is, are you providing a hint, or maybe ONC can think of a policy construct for certification that allows the base criteria set to rest and remain effective, but add to it that other criteria could emerge selectively without causing, you know, the prerequisite requirements for meaningful use qualification to be, you know, caused to change? Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but I think to the points that have been raised by Arian and by Brian, much of our focus in stage 1 and stage 2 has been around certification criteria so that EHRs have the functionality so that providers have the tools that they need to be able to meet the requirements for meaningful use. When I think about modular certification, there's a lot of different ways to interpret that. I mean, one way is to say, you know, we're going to get down to the level of, you know, individual modules, and we already have that capability to do individual modular certification for one or more of the meaningful use standards or criteria. But I think what you're suggesting is something a bit more fundamental, which is to say, you know, what is the role of certification in this larger ecosystem? And to me, right, separate from meaningful use, if you get rid of all those kind of programs and things like that, why would you want to certify something? And to me, the reason that you have a testing and certification program is that if you've got a standard that you believe will support interoperability, you want to test that someone has done it right. And that if they can pass the test and get that stamp of approval that says they're certified to that, that should mean something to someone else who has that stamp, because now they have the ability to exchange information. So it may be that there would be other kinds of programs that would establish a set of standards or specifications for how interchange would occur. And they could use a testing approach to say, rather than kind of creating a portal and requiring everybody to enter their information into that portal, we're going to create a specification and a standard. And then if people want to send us information using that standard, we want to make sure that they're certified to do that. So to me, I guess I'm not trying to say that there is a policy decision around the corner that we're going to go to this more modular approach. But I think tying together the pieces to say we need to support interoperability in all of its shape, and that as the meaningful use program enters the third stage, if you will, in what we've got to do, there's a whole series of other interoperability challenges around accountable care organizations, some of the initiatives with CMS and the like. Given what we've learned in meaningful use about creating specifications and testing to those so that we can certify products and create a marketplace of tools that follow those specifications, that may be an approach that others could use as well to try to get us closer to interoperability as well. So I don't necessarily consider that modular specifications or modular certification, but I do see, I think it's important to recognize that testing and certification is part of our approaches to getting to interoperability. Let me just say one more thing, and that is, you know, if we run into challenges with interoperability, so that product A doesn't interoperate with product B, we've got to recognize that there's a whole suite of different things that we could apply to help solve that problem. It could be that we need to modify our testing. And so to Wes Rischel's approach of sort of asymmetric information exchange, it could be that we test the send and allow them to have options in terms of what it is that they can send. But when we receive, you have to be able to test to option A and option B and option C. And so what we might do is, to get to that interoperability challenge, modify our testing approach so that we get better and better interoperability. It could be that we have to tighten our implementation guides. It could be that we need to add something to our standard directly. But I think we have to recognize that to get to interoperability, it's not just about changing the standard or tightening the implementation guide. It may be that part of what we have to do is to improve the way that we do testing so that we get to that better approach, if you will. So to me, it isn't so much modular certification or modular testing. It's really part of how we get to interoperability and to leverage certification as an approach.
Maybe a better way to have said it is that there's different program purposes that could benefit from certification. They're not all meaningful use, nor do they all get saddled onto, I know it may be a bad strong term, but saddled onto meaningful use prerequisites for certified EHR technology. And you recognize that in your response. So, I think that would be a tremendous policy innovation in the future to allow that to happen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Okay, Vince, we have a question coming up from you, I guess.
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks for the chance to be part of this, Doug. It's an honor. I want to amplify some of the earlier comments made by Arian and Brian and Devin, and around this dynamic of push and pull in the regulations, and begin by amplifying it and saying it's an opportunity, but in hindsight it also may be a necessity. What I'm observing is that necessarily and appropriately meaningful use stage 1 regulations really were regulatory push. You had to get some action out in the marketplace, and that continued through stage 2, and in turn, in the first draft of meaningful use stage 3 regs, they were also very much written in the first draft as pushing very specific requirements. And in turn, what I saw when I read a number of the comments, I haven't read them all, but I read maybe 20 of them, was a lot of pushback from the provider side, particularly folks saying, we're tired, we can't deal with this anymore, it's too hard. And connecting the dots there with the testimony that happened last week at the Health Information Exchange to some of the testimony, and I think the takeaway that was highlighted in a number of journal articles was that the real opportunity for Health Information Exchange is to tie the business case to the technical specifications, or in other words, to have the technical specifications pull from the opportunity that's being created in the marketplace by the changing in the economic incentives. And so I think the question or the comment I would want to leave you with is, I think it's worth reconsidering, really rethinking stage 3 meaningful use from ground zero in light of this dynamic with much more of a pull mindset. Example might be where we've got a very specific use case in the market already driven by Medicare around readmissions. Providers, understand now they have the incentive because they're going to be economically penalized. So opportunities to build meaningful use 3 much more around use cases that tie where there's an economic value proposition and the necessity is far less than the regulatory push. Thanks.
So thanks for that, Vince. I mean, part of what I hope we can do, and it's not easy, but I don't want the technology and the standards to get in the way of potentially beneficial policies or business models that would be helpful. And so it may be that we have to begin exploring some of those business models, realize that there are certain kinds of standards or specifications that we need to develop to support that, and then very, very quickly sort of get some draft standards, get them out there, get them used, and then gradually refine them over time so that they can be promulgated in a national way. I think it'd be curious and to get input from the communities to basically say, given what we have right now in terms of our portfolio of standards, what is it that we need to help support these new business models? Do we have everything we need? And if we don't, what are the additional pieces that we would need? And then I think the second piece to that is to think about, is there an incremental path to getting to where we want to go that would allow us to sort of make some progress in meaningful use stage 3 and set the stage for some of these new business models as well. And I think one of the things that we've been working on is to take a look at how do we create structure around more atomic kinds of data, because we need it for analytics. Clearly, you know, the accountable care organizations need to understand what's going on. They need to be able to aggregate data from lots of different sources, and that analytics can be supported if we can get more robust ways of describing more atomic kinds of data. And so that's one of the most recent initiatives that we've launched. There may be others that we need to think about with respect to these new business models, because those are the things that we want to put into our portfolio so that we don't let the technology get in the way of policy changes or things that we see coming down the pike that will benefit patients, reduce cost, and improve the quality of care delivered.
So if I can just make a quick follow-up. How will you know you're successful? The framework around business models and making that more explicit is, I think, really important. And you'll know you're successful when you see the network effects in the marketplace kick in. You know, network effects can happen at a very broad level where it's national, we're going to wait for that, but it can also happen within a small group of referring physicians, or like Facebook started within a university. And I think of what we're trying to accomplish at a very micro level is really kicking in the network effects and making that very, very explicit. And that would be driven by the right economic incentives within the right network.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to start someplace with people who are doing good work. And so, you know, it kind of goes back to the question that John had asked earlier. You know, how do you have federal standards or SDO standards, or if you don't have what you need, how do you in a small network kind of create something that works and then figure out ways that you can make that accessible to a broader audience? And so I think the point is well taken.
Thank you.
I wonder if Alice has a question.
I do. Thank you for coming back to me. Doug, you opened this conversation by talking about how this meeting, in addition to some of your recent blog posts and other activities, have as at their heart really a goal of increased transparency and community outreach. And in listening to this conversation, it's clear that there's great value in getting the input from the business, clinician, vendor side. And as I've been listening, though, I was reminded that I think there used to be a patient engagement power team as part of the Standards and Certification Committee that I believe I was a member of, which is embarrassing to say that I have been out of the loop, I think, since I switched from the National Partnership to coming over here and working with Devin at CDT. But I wanted to ask if and to what extent you think there is a role for transparency with the consumer community, obtaining outreach from them. You know, I'm struck by Devin bringing up this patient-generated data issue and saying that there have been conversations and pushback on that subject in the policy committee meetings, that maybe there's not great communication going on between that side and the standards or certification side, and just sort of where's the in? Is there an in for the hopefully have some knowledge of this more technical side of the policy debate?
So it broke up a little bit there, so I'm not sure I got everything that you had said. But I will say stay tuned. There are some new work groups, both in policy and in the standards, that are going to be specifically focused on consumers and consumer engagement. We see that as an important part of that portfolio. And I think that will give some dedicated attention and effort focused on making sure that we've engaged consumers appropriately, not only from a policy but also from a technical perspective as well. You know, what are the low-hanging fruit for the consumers? What are the things that they're using? What are the technologies that would be helpful to them? And how do we create the standards or the ways to engage the consumer side of things? One of the things that I want to make sure, and it's one of those things that keeps me up at night, is that what I don't want is two separate but equal systems. One that's geared towards providers and EHRs, and one that's geared towards consumers and mobile devices and home monitoring and things like that. We really need to make sure that a healthy healthcare system has the ability for both of those different kinds of communities, if you will, to come together and to have the ability to exchange information across those different places. And so I think some of the work on the consumer from a policy and consumer from a technical needs to address that, because we have not succeeded if the patient is seen as a separate kind of participant, if you will, from the rest of the healthcare system. It really needs to be a unified approach to how we exchange information.
Yeah, and I agree and appreciate you saying that. I think it's all too common for people on the more oriented toward the consumer side of things to say standards are too hard, technology is too hard, I don't get it. There's no part for me in that conversation. And I think what you're saying, and I appreciate and hope we can be part of that, is doing some translation service and hoping to find ways for consumers, and not necessarily Joe Schmo consumer, but people who are sophisticated enough to bring value, to be a meaningful part of those conversations.
And I will say that, you know, consumers can help drive this. I mean, consumers can say, listen, this is really helpful. You guys got to help us do more with this. And, you know, a lot of the work that we did with Abby and kind of developing a standardized approach to being able to download that information, moving from an ASCII text-based approach to one that included standards, we hope will allow vendors and entrepreneurs to be able to engage in that community in a much more robust way, and not have to spend all their time, money, and energy translating between ASCII text files. So it's those sorts of things that we need to be able to provide to the consumers, and figuring out how we can enable others to perhaps engage in that consumer approach. And so unique device identifiers, making sure that we have some understanding of how those devices communicate with the hub and then perhaps translate into the existing standards EHRs can understand. Those are all going to be important aspects of getting to this larger ecosystem.
Right.
Well, with that, I think we have gone over a little bit, so I want to thank everyone for joining us and participating, and we'd love to get your feedback about what you think about this platform. Doug, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Well, I've been engaged in that sort of the dialogue, but in my peripheral vision, I'm seeing all sorts of great stuff happening in the group chat as well. So I'm hopeful that there's a way that we can capture that, and I can, kind of take a look and review that as well. So I'm just putting it out there that I see that, but I haven't been able to participate. You guys out there have been able to type and multitask, and I've tried to focus a bit more on the questions that are coming through as well. I will say this, though. Thank you so much to everybody who's participated. Love to get some feedback about, what works, what doesn't, if there's a way that we can improve this. If this is something useful, then I'm prepared to do this on a regular basis to engage the community and figure out how we can have these kinds of conversations. I think that'd be tremendously helpful.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. I should say we had about 155 viewers who were following along on YouTube. So thanks again. I'm going to end the broadcast now, and we'll take your feedback later offline.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.